Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'll talk about an old game played back in the end of the 19th century. However, its lessons are just as valuable even today. Let's get started with a game that was played between Mises and Markelovich back in 1895 in Paris. White started out the game with the usual king-pawn move to e4, and black responded with e5. So far, everything as expected. And already the second move, white made an unusual move, and I would like to talk about it, why it's unusual and why it is inferior to some other choices. White in this position developed the knight to e2. The first part of the sentence sounded good. White developed. However, the problem is where the knight developed. It's true that the knight is controlling the d4 central square from e2, although obviously it cannot go there anytime soon because of black's pawn on e5. However, it also blocks up the view, the power, the mobility of white's bishop on f1. Compare it, if the knight would have gone to f3 on the other hand, the knight would not lock up the bishop's way and at the same time would control a second central square in addition to the d4 square. Moreover, it would actually attack black's pawn right away. It is quite a good idea and very efficient if you're able to combine more than one goal with your one move. It may be combining several of your own goals, or at times it may mean that you're combining your plan while defending against or preventing the opponent's plan. So let's go back and continue with knight e2, which is an inferior move to developing the knight to f3, or even compared to other moves like bishop to c4 or playing knight c3, just to mention a couple of the most popular second moves in this position. So the game continued with knight to e2, and black responded with an excellent move, developing his own bishop to c5. This move aims to white's weakest point on f2, although, of course, white would need to make further mistakes in order for black to be able to take advantage of that weakness. White in this position immediately reacted very actively and ambitiously, trying in a way to correct the inefficiency of the knight being on e2 compared to f3. This move attacks black's bishop and of course offers the exchange of pawns, which is the most likely response here, black capturing the white pawn. And now the idea is that the white knight got to d4 to a central square anyway, and one may think it didn't matter whether the knight chose the route of going to f3 and then d4, or instead, as in the game, to e2 and then d4. Well, that's in a way true. However, because the knight went to e2, it enabled black to develop his bishop to c5 instead of making a defensive move, protecting the pawn on e5 on the second move. So that's the difference, that now the black bishop is on c5 compared to the black knight on c6, which would be the most common second move after knight f3 on move 2. And now black immediately continues by playing knight to f6. Well, this move immediately attacks white's pawn on e4. If in this position white responds with the most logical move and ambitious move, that is to push the e-pawn forward to e5, then the black knight is attacked, but very typically for similar situations, and I certainly suggest for you to remember this pattern, the knight will not be forced to move away, but black has a better move by pinning white's pawn on e5 and playing queen e7. This not only indirectly protects the knight, but at the same time attacks white advanced pawn on e5, and black would have nothing to fear. So let's go back to the game when after knight f6, white responded by developing the knight and protecting this way the pawn on e4. It's important to remember that protecting the pawn with the bishop development to d3 would be a blunder, as now the white queen would no longer protect the knight on d4. It's important to point out that in this position it would be a blunder for white to protect the pawn with the bishop, as in that case the white queen would no longer protect the knight on d4 and black could simply capture it. So let's go back. After knight f6, white continued with knight c3, and as typically, it's best not to start an outright attack at such an early stage, but better first to get your army ready, put your king in safety, to make sure your rook can get into the action as well on the e-file. So black simply castled, certainly an excellent choice. Now black's plan is, in the next move, to play rook to e8 and immediately target white's pawn on e4. Here are the difficulties that white needs to face. On one hand, that if after that rook move, white would try to protect the pawn on e4 with the bishop to d3, that would fail for the same reason as we saw in the previous variation, because the knight on d4 would be hanging. The other natural defense would be to try to push the pawn up instead to f3 after the rook attack on the pawn, but that would have the difficulty that it would strengthen the power of black's bishop on c5, especially if the white king would try to castle to the king's side, and that would mean that the white knight on d4 would end up in a pin. Well, in any case, in this position, white continued with a natural developing move, bishop to e3, preparing perhaps to play f3 in the future and then to solidify the knight's position on d4. In this position, black continued as planned with the rook e8 move, although another interesting and not bad option was to play d5. We can clearly see that black is a bit ahead in development, in that his king is already castled and the black rook is ready for action on the e-file, while white still needs two more moves to develop and castle. And that is why it is a good idea for black to try to immediately take advantage of the temporary problem that white has, his king being still in the middle, potentially in the target of attack on the e-file. So black continued with rook e8, probably the best option, immediately going after the e4 pawn. Now, if white would indeed protect the pawn with f3, then d5 is a really good looking move, because now if pawn would take, of course the bishop on e3 would be hanging, and that would be sad news from white's perspective. White played an ambitious move, bishop to c4, which indeed does not directly protect the attacked pawn on e4, however it indirectly protects it. For example, if knight captures on e4, then knight could capture, rook captures, and now because the rook as well as the bishop on c5 are unprotected, it enables white a little combination by sacrificing his own bishop, and then if king captures back, white has a pleasant choice between forking the black rook and king, or even forking with queen h5 and forking the rook later, both giving white a clear advantage. So going back to this position, black smartly wasn't greedy and grabbed the pawn on e4, but instead continued with bishop b4, which creates a pin over the white knight on c3. So now black indeed threatens to capture the pawn on e4, or in some cases first trade on c3 and then grab the pawn on e4. Here white tried to hang on to that pawn by all cost, and eventually it costed him even more than the pawn. And here white continued with the most natural move, that is to protect the pawn with f3. But this was a serious mistake because now, because of the unfortunate positioning of all the minor pieces of white, given the exact situation, white gets in serious trouble. And the trouble is that black has a beautiful pin by the bishop as well as the rook. So you always have to be very careful in leaving your pieces in pins and on top of it on unprotected squares. That is why right now black was able to continue by playing d5, a very powerful move, on one hand attacking the white bishop on c4, on the other hand also attacking the pawn on e4. Because of the pins all over the place, white cannot capture on d5 without losing significant material. For example, the knight is pinned altogether. If the bishop captures, then after knight captures, white lost the bishop, because if pawn would capture knight, rook would capture bishop, and as you can see, black has a piece extra. After d5, if pawn captures, then of course immediately black would capture the bishop on e3. But what happens if white simply retreats the bishop, as he did in the game, by playing bishop to d3? Now the problem is different. The problem comes from yet another attack after black plays c5, attacking the white knight. And the problem is that when that white knight would move away, the next fork arrives and white cannot avoid losing either the bishop or the knight. Wow! It's amazing how these pawns just starting rolling down and killing white. Well, at this stage, white had to admit that they cannot avoid losing a piece, but still kept the fight going on by castling, allowing black to capture. Of course, this position on a higher level would be resignable for white, but on a beginner or club level, the game is not yet over. White can still put on some fight and challenges for the opponent. White continued with bishop captures. Well, white at least has a pawn for the lost piece and pretty much developed at this stage. Let's see how black converts the gained material advantage to a win. Black continued by capturing pawn to e4. Generally, as we know, when you're up in material, it's in your interest to trade further pieces to get closer to an endgame. Now white is in a new dilemma, because with black's last move, the d file has opened up and the black queen is aiming at white's dark squared bishop, and of course the other bishop is being attacked by black's pawn on e4. So white has to be careful not to lose a second piece. Therefore, white traded the bishop from d4 for the knight on f6, which black of course recaptures with the queen, making sure the pawn structure on the king side remains untouched and black wouldn't capture back with the pawn. And now white played pawn takes e4, which is not a simple recapture, but opening the f-file, opening some kind of attack, at least for now, on black's queen. And black moved the queen to h6, which is certainly not the only square the queen could go to, but certainly not a bad one either, because it aims at the h2 pawn, which could be attacked in the near future also by black's bishop from b4. After queen h6, white continued by playing e5, I think on one hand trying to prevent the black bishop getting to d6 and to threatening to checkmate, but also probably more importantly to open up the diagonal of white's bishop and to try to invite the black rook to capture this pawn, leaving the back rank unattended. Although in this particular case that was even a playable move. But this is one of those things when this is an unnecessary risk. Black is already materially in a winning situation, and one of the main tasks of black is here, other than developing his pieces, to make sure to avoid counterplay by the opponent. Now in this move the white idea would be to play bishop c4, open up the d-file for the queen. As we said, the back rank is unattended by the black rook now, and also at the same time the white bishop and rook would be aiming towards the f7 square. Although fortunately for black in this particular case, black is not without resources, and because of an intermediate check with queen to b6, and then when king moves out of the check, bishop e6, now that the queen already controls the entry on d8, black would be just fine. With all of that said, in this position after e5, it is safer and better for black to ignore that pawn and focus on what's important, and that is to develop the rest of the pieces. And that is why black responded with knight c6, that pawn on e5 now being attacked by two enemy pieces, so therefore it's not likely to run anywhere. White continued with knight d5, which on one hand threatens with a fork on the two black rooks, as well as keeps an eye on black's bishop on b4. Therefore, bishop moved away with a check, very important, gaining the momentum, gaining time. King moved out of the check, and now that the d-file is already locked up by white pieces, the black rook would safely capture the pawn on e5. Remember, again, this is a multi-purpose move. On one hand, the black rook moved out of the fork danger of the knight with knight c7, and on the other hand, it grabbed the pawn on e5. And third of all, it attacks, by the way, the white knight on d5. White continued with knight c7 anyway, attacking black's rook, and the rook moved to b8. It's worth mentioning that the d8 square, remember that could be a potential entry point to the white queen once the bishop would move from d3, is now guarded by black's knight. So black is not even in the shadow of danger there. White continued with bishop c4, renewing the threat to the f7 pawn. And again, black combines defense with development and plays bishop to f5, a very wise move, locking up the f-file from the white rook. After bishop f5, white continued with queen f3, and now black played bishop d6. A very powerful move. On one hand, attacks the knight on c7. And for example, if the knight would move back to b5, black would have plenty of excellent choices because of the threat of the bishop and the queen on h2. Remember, if now the rook from e5 would be gone, black would be ready to checkmate right away. And that means that it enables black to put his rook even to squares where normally it wouldn't be safe. Like, for example, capturing white's knight, and then if bishop takes checkmate, or after knight b5, putting the rook, for example, on e3. Again, same idea. Even though the rook is on an unprotected square, the threat towards h2 has been renewed, and if queen captures rook, then black checkmates immediately. And of course, white does not have the time to capture black's bishop on d6, because then the queen would be lost on f3. Ultimately, in this position, white is in a very major trouble, because at least they are about to lose a second piece, the knight on c7. And of course, white's choice of move, rook a to e1, wasn't any better, because now black simply captured the rook, and after rook takes back, the game ended with queen h2. Well, a very instructive game, and let's summarize what we learned through this lesson. Generally, try to develop your pieces in the beginning of the game in a way that they control as many of the central squares as you can. A second lesson: don't put your pieces in a way of one of your other pieces. And I'm primarily talking about the minor pieces here, your bishops and knight. They should get developed in coordination so they don't stand in each other's way. The next important lesson is, try to make sure you don't get into pins, or if you have no choice, try to get out of it as soon as you can. Another problem that white faced early on in this game, that he left his bishops on unprotected squares. It's a good idea to keep each of your pieces protected by another piece. That's typically a sign of good development. What did black do right in this game? Well, black followed all those basic principles, castled very quickly, and took advantage of the inefficiencies in white's position, namely pieces being on unprotected squares, the king staying in the middle longer than it should have, and immediately acted by centralizing his pieces, getting the rook to the e-file and opening the position, and taking advantage of the unfortunate positioning of white's minor pieces, which resulted in a very early fork by the pawn advancements of the d and c pawns. White lost a piece rather early and then tried to create counterplay, but by cautious play by black, it was all held back, and in fact, black developed a quick attack himself to win the game. Although, remember, it's more important to win the game at the end of the day than to start a premature attack. But in this particular game, black played pretty much perfectly, an excellent example on how to win a won game. Thank you for listening, and be back next week for some more chess instruction. Bye-bye.